President Trump is saying we may have to go back to work sooner than many of his critics would like. Plus, the House is going to vote on that rescue bill. And are we going to do a county-by-county loosening of restrictions in our fight against COVID-19? Plus, what's in this rescue package, the pork bonanza, and the China lying about aid situation? We'll get into that and much more coming up.
I want those guidelines to go even when we're open and fully operational. And frankly, much of the guidelines, like shaking hands, maybe people aren't going to be shaking hands anymore. You know, Tony had mentioned to me, Tony Fauci, the other day that I don't think he would be too upset with the concept of not shaking hands. He was saying that the flu would cut down, the regular flu would be cut down by quite a bit if we didn't do that, if we didn't shake hands. You know, the regular flu, of which, you know, you have a lot of deaths and a lot of problems with that, too. So I think a lot of great things are going to, when we're open, just to finish, when we're open, as soon as we open, that doesn't mean you're going to stop with the guidelines. You'll still try and distance yourself, maybe not to the same extent because you have to lead a life.
Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show, everyone. The president is saying that this is exactly it's really what I've been saying for a week now, which is that we have to accept at some point we're going to be making decisions about this that don't involve just hunkering down, battening down the hatches and refusing to go outside for business, for work purposes. This is something that now, as we continue to try to find ways to fight against the coronavirus, is gaining even more traction. The president's saying, look, we're going to have things in place that will continue to lessen the spread of this virus, but the 30-day lockdown is doable. The 3-month lockdown is painful and perhaps catastrophic. You go beyond that, and we're not going to have an economy to restart. And people are understanding that now. Now that we've seen 3.3 about officially unemployed just from this past week, there's a much greater understanding than there had been up to this point. Now that we see that the unemployment rolls are only going to go up, by the way, it's not just that last week there was really high unemployment. It's that in the weeks ahead, there is nothing but one direction this will go in. You know, usually you have a bad employment report and people will say, oh, well, it'll rebound. Maybe it was bad weather. We all know that this is just going to drop off a cliff. And so that's why the president yesterday in his press conference was trying to address some of his critics who were saying that he's, you know, putting grandma's life in jeopardy for a 401k. Everyone is in jeopardy right now. The economy is in jeopardy. This virus puts all of us in jeopardy. I'm here in New York City in quarantine. There is also a growing recognition that cities are in a worse spot with this. If you are out in areas of the country where you have a lot more social distance just by virtue of the fact that you have to deal with a lot fewer people on a day-to-day basis. I mean, think about just in case you haven't really gone through this. And I know a lot of you who have, more space, more air around you. You already know this without me telling you. But someone like me, when I go on the subway, you're usually packed to get into the subway. And this is the reality for millions of New Yorkers, literally millions of people every day. I think 3 million people are in the New York City subway system every day. And this is why we've been hit worse than other cities. You look at Los Angeles, people, the gym, the bar, the grocery store, there are certainly opportunities for infection. And one of the big problems, as we're recognizing, is infection in the home, which is why Governor Cuomo yesterday, and I'll get into this more later, is saying maybe sending everybody home wasn't, in fact, the best idea. But in New York City, we are packed like sardines. I don't know why sardines are more tightly packed than other things, but we are packed like sardines, and you are shoulder to shoulder on the way into the subway, butt to butt, back to back on the subway, crammed in there. You've probably seen video footage of this. That's the reality. You are as close to people. You are so close to people every day that their bodies are pressed up against you, and you just think that this is normal because this is what everyone's doing, but you're actually in physical contact with strangers every day, lots of them, every single day. So that means that it's really easy. You got to remember, every person you're in contact with, they're all going to different places. They're all distributed around the city. The subway system alone is like a virus distribution system. So that's important for everybody when we're thinking about how we can get a handle on this disease and what we can do. If you look at the places where the greatest transmission happens, it's in very close quarters and it's by touch. And all you need is one person on a crowded subway car to sneeze, let's say, and those aerosolized droplets are there and the subway is packed and you could infect a whole bunch of people. So if you live in, West Texas, if you live in, more outlying areas of Kansas, places where I know a lot of you who listen to the show do live, out in Oregon, not in Portland necessarily, but in the rest of the state, you don't have to deal with as many people. So you're not seeing the same degree of infections. And I think it's very possible that you will not see the same degree of infection anytime soon in those areas. That said, other cities are getting hit pretty hard right now. New Orleans, particularly places that have a really large global tourism trade. Destination places are getting hit really hard. There's a lot of concern over what's going to be the final caseload in places like Las Vegas, for example. You have huge influx of tourists from all over the world. And as we know, at least in the early stages of this, there's a direct correlation. There's a direct line between travel from China, from Wuhan in particular, and the areas around it. There's a direct correlation where those routes, places and cities that have a lot of folks visiting, they got hit particularly hard. It's certainly the case with northern Italy, where you have a massive influx of Chinese nationals who, for the Lunar New Year, were traveling in particular, but also because of the textile industry in northern Italy, which is largely now run by and owned by a lot of Chinese interests. It was just a perfect storm for this virus. So the president is taking the approach that he should here. And I know that for a few days, there were a lot of libs who were running around yelling about how if you even want to have this conversation, you're doing so because you don't care about grandma. That's viciously, aggressively stupid. And now we see the experts, like even Dr. Fauci, are saying, hey, guess what? We are going to need to have a conversation about what risks we take. And while we are taking risks, there will be the possibility of rebounds. That's a quote from Dr. Fauci, rebounds of this virus. But the alternative is just continued total lockdown, which other countries are not going through that are dealing with this. South Korea is not in a state of absolute lockdown the way that New York City is right now, and the way that some other cities and states are. We're also going to see a lot of tension between state and local governments restricting travel, which you usually never see that, right? I mean, in this country, as much as producer Mark and I might make jokes about the New York-New Jersey rivalry, there's never anybody in New Jersey who's like, what are you doing crossing the river? You're supposed to stay over there in New York. And, generally we in New York are the ones who are telling people from New Jersey, what are you doing? But nonetheless, right now we're in a moment of absolute crisis, so much so that you might have state authorities, local authorities who are saying, no, you're not allowed to, there's no cross-state, cross-county travel unless you're in an exempted situation, you're a truck driver, you're, involved in that life maintenance sector of the economy that's still open. So this is why the patchwork approach, I guess you could call it, place by place, county by county, is going to gain a lot of traction here soon, because we need areas that can have more commerce to do so. We need to get the parts of our economy. We're a very large country of 320 million people. China has 1 billion people. Is China on lockdown, the whole country? No. Do we think that the Chinese government is more adept at dealing with this? Do we think that Chinese public health? One thing that I haven't talked to you about before is there is a tremendous amount, and this does not really get, you will not hear about this from our media, but my contacts in China have been talking to me in recent weeks about how the Eastern medicine, which is what we generally refer to it as here, there's Eastern medicine that is really very rudimentary and something more along the lines of which you consider traditional and almost practices of magic. I don't know what you would call it, but it's not based really in science. That leads very much into these wet markets in China where they're selling these different animals, because you might be thinking, why Why would anybody eat a pangolin? They don't know what it tastes like. Well, in Eastern medicine, there are different animals, and eating them is considered. I mean, one of the more famous examples is something they do with tigers, and they make a soup out of a part of a tiger. Rhinoceros horn. This is another one that's very well known. Rhinoceros horn is made out of keratin, the same thing that your fingernails are made out of. And yet there is a widespread belief across much of Asia. And I say widespread, I'm not talking about people that are university professors in Beijing, but among the less affluent, educated populace of China in particular, people think that this is a cure for different diseases. And so that's just, it's one, I think, instructive about how we have these wet markets where you have 100 different wild animal species all brought together in inhumane and deeply dangerous circumstances in terms of disease transmission. But also the Chinese public health system is nowhere near our public health system. You see them throwing together all these hospitals really fast. Trust me, you don't want, if you have a choice between being in a Chinese hospital, being in an American hospital, the National Health Service in Britain is a little scary. I'd probably rather be in Northern Italy, but a European hospital, you'd much rather choose the latter. So we'll get more into China and what they're doing right now, because their propaganda campaign is all out. I mean, they really think that they're going to be able to rewrite the history of this pandemic and blame it on America. And we may go back in time and look at this historical moment as a point at which the Chinese began to establish, this is their plan, that they began to establish true global hegemony because we overextend ourselves financially, and they managed to blame us in a lot of ways for this. I'll go through. I know it sounds crazy, but remember, the first goal of propaganda for an authoritarian regime, a communist country like China, it's not really communist, but it's the Communist Chinese Party or Chinese Communist Party that runs it. The first goal of their propaganda is to convince their own people. Convincing all of us is much. So many of the messages that you see being fired out are meant to give ammunition to the toadies of the regime back in China. Hey, see, this is what the authorities are saying about what happened in America, and they're going at the Americans with this. Must be kind of true, right? So we have that to discuss. We also have this bill. I mean, there's a ton of moving pieces happening right now. Congressman Massey getting a lot of heat over trying to slow things down because he says there's a lot of pork in this. Absolutely true. There is a lot of pork in this bill. There's no question that this is another example of Congress being unable to put aside its parochial interests and just be serious about things in the most serious moment this country has faced. Look, this is worse than 9/11. I mean, I'm somebody who joined the CIA because of 9/11. I know all about the terrorist groups that were going after us, not just on that day, but for years and years afterwards. I know about plots that have come to light since then. I know about a lot of plots that didn't get that far along, but that would have been catastrophic that people don't know about. There's really very little comparison in my mind between now and then, because we knew we were facing an enemy. It was going to be rough, but we knew we would win that. And we know we will win this too, but the casualties that we face here remain very much a big question. We were never going to have a mass casualty event realistically fighting against Al-Qaeda, fighting against Iraq or Afghanistan. It just wasn't going to happen because of our military superiority. Here, I still think that the lower end of the spectrum of losses is much more likely for us. But there are circumstances. I mean, I've been reading, as a lot of other people have, about the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918, and there are circumstances where this could get a whole lot worse and get out of control. What happens when the southern hemisphere goes into winter, by the way, and you have countries with much less developed public health systems that are much poorer, but also have serious population density? There are some places. What happens when they are faced with this? And how do we deal with the rebound of it? But the rebound won't be the second wave. The rebound would just be an outbreak in addition to what we've already seen here. Fauci addressed this yesterday. The second wave would be what we would see in the fall when this makes a comeback, which it will. So we need to get to that as well. But the fundamental point here is that we now we're waging two battles simultaneously. All right, two battles are underway. The fight against the virus to minimize casualties, to take care of as many Americans as we can, get the equipment out there. That's one. The other is to understand the risks, take intelligent risks, know that it won't be perfect, but we've got to get out there and start going start going forward with economic activity so that we can do the first thing, because this fight is going to extend for a long time. Someone needs to feed and pay our medical personnel. Someone needs to feed and give them money to keep them fed, but we need to pay for, people that are in our supply chain, truck drivers, first responders, police, fire. I mean, all the officials that are holding civilization together right now, they rely on economic activity. Without that economic activity, they can't do what they're doing to fight against the virus. So now we've moved into that phase of recognition, even before we've hit the biggest spike, which is going to be within a couple of weeks. So, like I said, team, a lot to get to today, so strap in for it.
This is Governor Greg Abbott saying thank you to the truckers who are hauling all the goods and supplies across the state of Texas that are so desperately needed. Thank you for taking them to the grocery stores, to the other stores, to make sure that all the shoppers in Texas and our fellow Texans, they have these needs for the supplies that you're delivering, and they wouldn't be there without you taking them there. Thank you for your tireless work to make sure Texans will have all the supplies they need. God bless our truckers, and God bless Texas.
There's that saying attributed to Napoleon that an army marches on its stomach. Well, if we're in a fight right now, a war against a virus, we also are marching on our stomachs. And the only way that we can keep them full is because of our distro and supply chain. And truckers are the backbone of that. I know we have so many of you who listen to this show either on stations as you crisscross the country or also on podcast. Thank you for doing what you do. And every day we'll try to give some shout outs to the people that are the reason why, here in New York City, for example, which is so hard hit by this, here in New York City, we only have grocery stores. I mean, if the grocery stores started having shortages, you would have panic and riots. So the people that are delivering food to the stores here, that are making sure that, we still have groceries, basic medicine, household goods. And I understand that there's some concern, too. People have got to get out of the truck. They got to unload. No one wants to get sick. We all understand. But they're keeping this country going. So we are also an army in America against this virus that marches on our stomach. And the people that are delivering and cooking and preparing food as well, people that are still staying open, restaurants that are trying to. I mean, it's bleak out there. I went for a walk last night down one of the most crowded streets. I mean, a place where usually you would be dodging just tourists every 2 steps and street performers, and especially this time of year, no man's land. It was like crossing over from, English to German lines in Flanders in the First World War. I mean, there was nothing out there. Stores all shut down. Some of them now boarded up just in case. That's a little bit of an ominous sign. But thank you for keeping, all of you out there, thank you for keeping the stores stocked, because that is essential right now. We got to keep our medical providers geared up, and we got to keep our stores stocked, or else we're going to have even bigger problems.
I'm sure many of you saw the recent report out of the UK about them adjusting completely their needs. This is really quite important. If you remember, that was the report that said there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. They've adjusted that number in the UK to 20,000. So 500,000 to 20,000. We're looking into this in great detail to understand that adjustment. I'm going to say something that's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that we can all understand it together. In the model, either you have to have a large group of people who are asymptomatic, who've never presented for any test, in order to have the kind of numbers that were predicted. To get to 60 million people infected, or of 6 million people infected, you have to have a large group of asymptomatics, because in no country to date have we seen an attack rate over 1 in 1,000. So either we're only measuring the tip of the iceberg of the symptomatic cases, and underneath it are a large group of people So we're working very hard to get that antibody test, because that's a good way to figure out who are all these people under here and do they exist. Or we have the transmission completely wrong. So these are the things we're looking at, because the predictions of the models don't match the reality on the ground in either China, South Korea, or Italy. We are about 5 times the size of Italy. So if we were Italy and you did all those divisions, Italy should have close to 400,000 deaths. They're not close to achieving that. So these are the kinds of things we're trying to understand. Models are models.
The models do not line up with what we've seen as reality so far. That's Dr. Deborah Birx, who I think has become, for some people, I mean, it's Birx and Fauci, obviously, who are at the press conference, that are both providing a tremendous amount of really useful information. And by the way, the information is quite useful. We're all making decisions, at least in particularly affected areas. I know for a lot of you, this is mostly right now an economic issue, because there are counties where there are 0 cases of this that are at least known so far. But understand that there will be some cases in a whole lot more counties, and the economic reality of the what this is doing in cities is something that affects the whole country. So that's obviously why we're all in this together, even if you're in a place where, you know, you see 2 people a week outside your own family and you don't think that there's any real threat of COVID infecting, you know, your township, which has 200 residents, right? So for those who are in areas like that, I understand you're looking at this like, why do we have to, has the response been as extreme as possible? And the real turning point here was Italy. And honestly, it was that there were 2 moments that I saw where my analysis of this had to ratchet up. And it was when we first saw real data out of Italy. And it was it's very hard with China and looking at all the modeling. And you have so many different factors that come into play when people are talking about how bad this will be. There are some who very clearly act with some degree of bad faith and do not, that they want this to be on the worst side, at least for the administration. They want to make sure they can blame the administration, and it needs to be pretty bad for that to be the case. We've been aware of that from the beginning. People have been blaming Trump from before there was even a response. I was on the Bill Maher show, and we had not a single U.S. death from COVID-19, and they're saying that Trump botched the response, and he's terrible, and we're all going to die. And I'm looking at them saying, I don't even understand how we can have this conversation before we know what has happened. But they hate Trump, and that's all that really matters to them. It's very difficult to make assessments, good assessments of this based on the Chinese data, because we know the Chinese are lying, and we know that the Chinese Communist Party is ruthless. I mean, China is a modern state. It's the 2nd wealthiest country in the world now by GDP, and China is a modern state that still has internment camps for the Uyghurs in Western China. So we understand it's a deeply immoral country. I mean, they execute people for corruption and no one even really knows what the person did. I mean, there's all kinds of, it's a thugocracy, a really powerful one. In fact, it's very similar in a lot of ways to what you have in Russia, where instead, in Russia, it's concentrated in Putin and his circle of cronies, but it's really Putin. In China, it's just a committee instead of an individual, but really wields the same absolute power and authoritarianism. And so in the early days, they were suppressing information coming out of China as much as they possibly could. So it was very hard to make real determinations. It wasn't until we saw what happened in Italy, then it was, okay, this is going to be a real threat to our elderly and immunosuppressed populations. And then when President Trump said that we were doing the shutdown of all travel from Europe that night, that was the other shoe dropping for me. All of that said, here we are now deeper into this crisis, and there are still people who are putting out what I would consider to be very irresponsible projections about what is likely to happen. What is possible to happen is not really relevant. What could theoretically occur is not something that should be widely publicized. You know what could happen? In any given year, a flu virus could mutate, and all of a sudden we have a global pandemic that comes out of nowhere. I mean, that could happen tomorrow. So what could is not something that should get nearly the attention. But from the media, you have 2 very powerful impulses that affect so much of the way that they're doing their jobs right now. One is there is, maybe it's subconscious, although I think in some it's conscious, but a desire for catastrophe that they can pin on President Trump, and also just the if it bleeds, it leads concept on steroids. Things that are scary get clicks. I can't tell you how many stories I see, and it's getting very annoying because I think it's so dishonest and it's just adding to everybody's anxiety. But you keep seeing these stories about, healthy 42-year-old dies from COVID-19 in some American city or, here in New York, wherever. And then you read in and you find out, well, he was somebody who had chronic emphysema and type 1 diabetes or something. And you go, okay, well, I mean, this is still a tragedy for this person and his family, but they're obviously overselling the risk to the healthy in the headline as a means of scaring even more people than are already scared. So there's a lot of irresponsible stuff going on, and Dr. Birx is trying to address that as best she can here by saying, look, we can't even, all we do all day is try to look at what's happening and what we can do and how we can mitigate risk and how we can anticipate things going even more badly in a certain area. And there's just no way that the projection of 2 million dead Americans based on this study in the UK and 600,000 dead Brits, that it tracks with what we're seeing right now already happen in Italy. Italy was essentially give this disease in a confined part of a densely populated country, give the disease a solid month of just total rampant spread, no one knows what's going on, and then try to deal with it. So we would think that should be, the percentages on that would give us a real sense of worst case scenario. And even the Italian scenario doesn't add up to what the UK is seeing. And right now we're taking all these measures. I mean, New York is the most crowded part of the United States, the most densely populated, of 8.6, I think, something like that, million people that live here. It's a lot. And you can walk around the streets here and not be within 10 feet of anybody, easily. You can walk around the streets and you can basically walk down the street, not the sidewalk, and cars, there's only a few coming by, they'll just drive around you. That's where we already are. So clearly, I just bring that up because there's massive changes that are underway right now to limit the spread of this thing. And that's not really being taken into account by those initial models that we saw. So I think that's really important for everybody to remember. There are these scientists that have come out at Stanford, super smart Stanford guys, and not Unitas. I feel like I pronounced that like producer Mark. Wasn't that a football coach or a player?
Johnny Unitas, just one of the best players of all time. No big
right,
deal.
one of the okay, he's a player, yeah.
Yeah.
But this guy is like Ioannidis. It's like a Greek name. It's not Unitas. It's like something close. Anyway, he did the analysis of this that it wasn't really quite as it wasn't going to be as deadly as everyone had been saying. And then you had two other people at Stanford, medical researchers, who've also crunched the numbers, and they've said that, look, we've run this experiment a little bit in Italy, where you've had rampant spread among an elderly population and on a cruise ship. And, if this disease just spreads in a confined area, you're looking at about 1% fatality rate and maybe a 10 to 15% hospitalization rate, something along those lines. Now, that would be just spreading entirely in a confined area with no mitigation measures, with no knowledge of social distancing or anything else that's going on. That's clearly not what we're facing. And in truth, they're going to find out. There are a couple of things that are going on now. One is they're going to find out, and most experts are saying this, and I in my gut believe this, so I'm going on expert knowledge here. I don't have expert knowledge, but I'm also telling you that this adds up for me. This makes sense for me. And I am the guy, and I was reminded yesterday that I've been saying, I think it was in July or August, when I was asked what keeps me up at night, and now I remember, and I said pandemic disease. And I've also a few times said these idiots that are worried about climate change should be worried about pandemic disease. I've said that in the last year. I mean, if those of you who listen to the show enough know that that's the truth. I'm just saying. Some of us knew that this was a problem while the lunatics were running around saying the world was going to melt because of cow farts. So stepping back for a second here to what we've seen in the, with the overall numbers, because now, CNN yesterday was doing this whole America has more cases than any other country. First of all, bull. All right. We have more cases that we know about because China is trying to cook the books, and they have been from the very beginning. This people keep saying this is China's Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl was, and the show is very good, although as I told you, there's a lot of unnecessary poetic license they took. Radiation is not contagious from person to person. Someone doesn't get irradiated and then a week later they hug their wife and the wife will die. That's not how it works. So I don't know why they had to do that. It's scary enough without doing that stuff. So, but the reason that Chernobyl was so, is something that's so historically powerful in our memory, one, because the show was actually quite good, quite well done, but also it was at the end. I mean, the Soviet Empire was already a sclerotic, crappy, inept rule of idiots. And so that just made everyone think these morons can't do anything right, And you have the Soviet-Afghan war, same idea. These idiots can't even, with throwing everything they've got at these mujahideen, they can't even beat them. They got Chernobyl. I mean, they just look like a bunch of morons, which they were. And so that's how the Soviet Politburo and the Soviet, High Committee and all that fell. And you have in China a much bigger issue than Chernobyl, really, that people are saying maybe this is a risk. So on the one hand, it's an opportunity for China, depending on how bad it is for America. But there's also the systemic risk to the Chinese Communist Party's power that is going to put people on edge over there for a while. Because there must be enough people who know about. Then this is also why they suppress information, and why the WeChat app that everyone uses over there, and there's so much censorship that goes on. Because if people knew the truth about the Chinese government, they'd say, "Why do we have these morons in charge? They're vicious and corrupt, and they're not even good at." You'd think that a high-tech totalitarian regime would be best placed to deal with a pandemic like this and to stifle it. But, in Singapore, you have essentially a benevolent authoritarianism, and they will stifle this thing pretty quickly. In China, you have a dictatorial and vicious totalitarianism, and they were not able to stop this thing. So I'm a big believer, though, in us getting more information that will calm people, I think, a bit going forward. Not calm them entirely, but will help us understand the real scope of this thing and where it's all going. I'll get into some of that.
Do we know yet if getting corona and surviving corona means that you're now immune to the disease, or is there a chance of reinfection?
We don't know that for 100% certain because we haven't done the study to see re-challenges, whether they've been protected. But I feel really confident that if this virus acts like every other virus that we know, once you get infected, get better, clear the virus, that you'll have immunity that will protect you against reinfection. So it's never 100%, but I'd be willing to bet anything that people who recover are really protected against reinfection.
Dr. Fauci laying it down there. Obviously, essential to know that there would be immunity after an infection with this disease. And that's because they're working on a test now, an antibody test, that would let you know. You might have had this and not known. I had a really bad cold at the end of December, for example. I think that's probably too early for this, but maybe I just thought it was a really bad cold, right? I'm sure some of you have the same thing. When they look at the testing, even in South Korea, where they've done all this testing, and we've done more testing in 8 days than South Korea did in 8 weeks. The president has been bringing that up in the last couple of days. But 94% of tests where people had symptoms in South Korea, it was not coronavirus. It's a cold or it's the flu, but there's obviously a lot of crossover in the symptoms. So if you can find out if you have had this and didn't even realize it, then that takes a tremendous amount of strain off you, assuming that you have immunity, which is the point he's getting to here. Now you can go around and you don't have to worry. And it also means you could be around if they've proven you've got immunity now from this, which they're going to be finding out soon. He's basically saying it's 99%. But if you get immunity, then that means that you could be going back to work, going around, people who are elderly and not worried because you wouldn't be at risk of infecting them because you'd be protected from being infected because you've already been infected. Now, this is the case. This is basic immunology stretching back to the earliest days of vaccination and how that whole process works. I'm just going to say this right now, though. You heard Dr. Fauci there. if he said, like, I'm very, very calm. And this is a guy who doesn't blow, smoke and sunshine, sunshine and rainbows. Smoke and sunshine, that wouldn't be good. Sunshine and rainbows at people. But you've heard Dr. Fauci there. He was very clear about it. And I'm just going to say this. If we end up finding out, and this is just my belief, this is my analysis, but if we find out that somehow this virus is like the only virus that Dr. Fauci has ever heard of, really, where you don't have respiratory infection like this, where you don't have immunity afterwards, I'm just going to go on record and say, if we find out you don't have immunity, this was engineered in a Chinese lab. No question in my mind. There's no way, there's too many pieces that would have to go. Now, I don't think that's going to end up being the case. And I think the really good news is we will have immunity. But I just want to go on record now. If for some reason this is the 1 in 1,000 for viruses where you don't get immunity, it's because the Chinese built this thing and the monster got out and is attacking all of us.